you, Julie, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight in the webinar. This is the last one of the series of 4 that we've presented this year. We've already discussed a bit on enrichment and secret lives of horses, and today we're going to discuss a couple of tips and some strategies for paddock design. We will be a bit limited with time, and so I won't be able to go in too much detail in some of the more details of how we should plan our property and look at water harvesting and things like that. We're going to focus mainly on the paddock side, but still very important to look at the bigger picture. If you're not familiar with my background or my talks or my educational workshops, I have an extensive background in animal and equine science. I've done various research projects looking at mineral balances in ponies and gut health in racehorses. And my latest project is this here picture of one of my trials where I looked at the behavioral mechanisms of diet selection, and I was particularly interested in the taste and smell of horses and so-called post-ingestive feedback, so on which cues do horses make diet choices, and do horses have this nutritional wisdom to pick up on the nutritional content. So all that work is now all bundled in one thesis that I'm trying to finalize. So still a couple of revisions I have to do. And also the papers are getting very close to be published by the Applied Animal Behavior Science Journal. So once that gets out, I will definitely post a link on our new Facebook page, which I will show at the end of the presentation. So besides my academic interest, and I have also a consultancy where I offer nutritional advice, property and pasture management consulting, and on the sideline I'm also involved with being an official and a coach. And then I have another hat on, which is promoting the equine permaculture movement, which kind of originated from my pasture and property consulting, but it's on its own, it's an entity on its own, and it's really more about the educational side of things and books, and hopefully very soon also permaculture designer courses, particularly for the equine community. But I'm still working on that, still need to find a little bit more time. I'm still dealing with a couple of research projects, so I want to finish that off and then look into creating a curriculum and some new books. So probably the first one I would like to write is about fodder trees. We already talked a little bit about that in our enrichment, and throughout my webinars we always seem to come back to these fodder trees. So I think that it's soon very time for me to write something more detailed about it and come with a little booklet for Australia or even on international scale. Okay, enough about my background. So let's get started and talk about pasture and property design. So first of all, we need to kind of highlight why would we actually need a plan? Why do we need a plan for our property and pasture? And there are 3 main reasons. Of course, we want to prevent and reduce pasture problems, and particular weeds and compaction and waterlogging. Those are things that we really would like to avoid or reduce as much as we can on our property, which also will help with soil conservation, and most importantly for our horses to offer forage availability, so grass cover or vegetation cover. Also, we need to think about the health of the horse, so having grass cover will be beneficial for the nutrition, but also better for their feed and for their respiratory system. As you can see here in the top picture, when it's very muddy like this can really affect the health of their hooves and all kinds of problems that most horse owners are quite familiar with: skin problems, hoof abscesses. Of course, when it's dusty and if it gets dried up and it gets very dusty, then we also can get problems in respiratory or allergies. So those are things we want to avoid. Also, we would like to have a property that we can enjoy, that we have a nice aesthetic view that we can enjoy, but also our neighbors. So we have to also think about the social aspect. It's not, as horse owners, we seem to do the right thing for the horse, but we kind of forget that we're in a community, and we also need to look at how can we keep the aesthetics of the property. But also, if you want to sell the property, and if you want to make some money out of the property, having a good setup and showing that that you can manage your horses on either small or large acreage in the correct way will be a really good selling point. So these are the main reasons why we should really look at our design. And when we talk about pasture design, we of course have to zoom out and actually look first at our property. We cannot go straight in and start subdividing our paddocks. We need to really look at the current layout on the design of our property. Most people have already an existing layout, where the others are maybe very fortunate to have a blank canvas and can really design it to their liking. So we need to look at the land shape and the contouring. So are you on a flat part of a land, do you have a flat land? Do you have a very undulated or very hilly block? Those are things that you need to consider in designing. We also need to look at natural resources. Those are very valuable, and it's the key to becoming sustainable, is really take care of those and design in such a way that you can either harvest water and store energy. Those are the two. Storing energy. Water is needed, of course, for pasture growth and for water consumption for animals, for ourselves. But also we need to think about energy as in, for instance, the growth of pasture, that we can then mulch, and that mulch can actually be used to create more soil, develop soil, or we can even use our manure of the horse, which undergone digestion, and that we can then use for putting that back onto the pasture as a fertilizer. So we need to look in cycling, and natural resources are a very important aspect of that. So water management is one of the first things that you need to look at in pasture design and in property design. Then the second thing that is very important is look at access. So we would like to have the least costs for placing roads, but also we want to place them in a correct way that we can reduce erosion. So as possible, we would like to do it on contour. Same thing with when we look at fencing, but it's not always possible. Sometimes the location of already the house or the stables are already put in an old-fashioned design to have the best view, and so it's then hard to kind of redirect all of that, and also will be very costly. But if you have if you're able to make new shelters or stables, then you can look into how well is the best and the least change that I can do to kind of make an access road to these facilities. And the same thing for laneways when we get into the pastures, but we'll talk about that a little bit later with some examples. And then finally, once we understand where our water goes, how we should harvest it, where can we harvest, and we know where our access roads are and where potentially our laneways can go for pasture, for our pasture subdivisions, or for towards our central points or track paddocks, then we can look at structures. So looking at the fencing, shelters, stables, arenas, housing. So it is very important that you see your property design like building a house. We don't start with a roof and start placing arenas and then think about the foundation, which is water harvesting. So you have to work in this way, even if you're having already a design property. So first water, then access, then structures. That's the way to think about designing. Then how do we get to all that information? So the best thing best friend is a good site map, because that makes landscape design much easier. So we're gathering information. There are many organizations that can help you. There's a lot of free online access to Google Earth. Google Pro is even for free. You can get maps, and in certain states you have actually an overlay, so you need to go to a link. So for instance, New South Wales has a link called Globe, and you have to open that link, and then it connects with your Google Earth, and then it gives you contouring and parcel information and quite a lot of useful information that you can use for free and can help you with your designing. But of course, council maps and also your, for instance, the organizations such as NRM can also offer you help with getting these maps because they also have additional information as in vegetation and also flooding, so where potential dangers are of flooding. Those things are very useful, and there are pretty much most of it, unless you need to do, if you're a blank canvas, you have a blank canvas, there's not a lot of information about your property. You may have to do, may need to get some people out there for surveying and then to make a contour map for you, but most properties are quite easily found in one of these systems, and a lot of is, as I said, for free. So that is just a little bit of effort, but a very important part before we can get started. We can use that then to, there's even soil types, vegetation, cropping. I know that when I was in Queensland, they were very detailed with that, and when we did one of our property design workshops there, we got like 3 or 4 different maps of the property with all this information, which is very useful. Then what we can use these maps then to do overlays. So you can use transparent overlays and use markers like Sharpie pens to start drawing, or if you're very fancy, you can do it all online with programs such as Paint or Photoshop, or any of those are useful. It just depends on how much time you want to spend on it and how easily you do it, because you don't want to spend too much time on it. You need to be able to put an idea on it and put it away and then do it again. And I personally like the overlays initially before I draw it into a more fancier program, or if people really want it, I send it off to a person that does really beautiful aquarelle or painting drawings for clients. So here it talks about flexible observation option system. It's very important because designing is never, I think, there's never an end result. It always stays quite dynamic. So here, for instance, is a typical overlay that I use. So this is council map with the contouring. This is my property in Armadale, and it has just a transparent overlay, and I show you here the current infrastructure. So one of the first things you do when you look at your paddock design or your subdivisions, you look at your current infrastructure and you draw that in, and the current access. And so, for instance, your driveways, these are grass driveways. Anything here in orange are all grass laneways or driveways. We have 2 accesses here, one to the house and yard, and we have one here to the cattle yard, which has a little central point, and then a big shed, and we have 2 horse stables in that. And the rest is all permanent fencing, and we have only 5 large paddocks. So the numbers are highlighting that we have 5 large paddocks, which are at this stage not subdivided. And you also want to highlight your natural resource. So you want to kind of look at where your water is, so your dams, any swales, any flooding areas. Those are all things that you want to put on your first map. You can go fancier, like when I do designs, I put the sun angle in the design. I put the wind directions. If you are in a fire hazard area, prone area, definitely it will be determined on the wind. But you kind of put arrows where would your biggest threats come from when you have a fire, bushfire. Those are all things that you can add to it. I kind of kept it very simple. I was kept very crowded on a page, but you can add as many information on there just to get you to get a clear idea of all your natural resources and also your vegetation. So here I highlighted in the dark green, those are the tree laneways that have been planted. So this property was part of a larger farm, and it's been subdivided in 100-acre lots. So this altogether is around 100 acres, a little bit under. I think it's 995, something like that. But all of these are around the same, and they were all part of this farm on this site. So this all belonged to that, but they all subdivided it. On the map, it's very important that you have the contouring, because it will give you an idea of the steepness of the land, and if you need to be aware of erosion, and that will help you also with dictating how you may want to put, for instance, laneways on the property on contour. But as you can see, the shorter, the closer these lines are together, the steeper it is. So here we have a hill, and it gets less steep, and we're actually on the ridge of this hill, and our catchment is actually on all my neighbors' properties, and we're actually not catching as much water. So even though we have here the dam, probably this is the only one at this stage that has most water, and it's not even properly built. So we are struggling a little bit with the current dam designs. So clearly this property needs to do better when it comes to water harvesting. We do have, of course, rainwater, and we rely on that currently quite a lot. So we have here a central point with all our water taps, and so we can, for all these 4 paddocks, we have a straight line for water. This one we can get water from the dam, but we may want to look into a bore. We may want to look at key lining. We may want to look at redesign of the dams, but because we're on a ridge, we will never be very successful in harvesting a lot of water, because it just kind of runs on the sides here. Those are the main catchments. As you can see here, there's a dam here, and then a dam there, and there's a top dam here, and then on this side. So we're just missing out on that. But therefore, looking into strategies such as swale design, slowing down water when water does come on our property, rainwater, that we slow it down using swale designs. Looking into key lining, those are deep ripping and using a particular pattern where we can redirect water. Those will be strategies that we have to look into. We only recently moved here, so it's only like October, so it's a very recent property. So looking at that is very important, and I'm just giving my property as an example, but this is something that you can go through for yourself. Then again, just a bit of a checklist. We need to think, as I said, about water. Water points are very important, particularly when we get to that point where we want to do the subdivision. So shape of the land are already addressed. Certain areas may just not be suitable for horses. Very steep hills and slopes. Our property doesn't have that problem. But if you are in a hilly area, and when I go to the Gold Coast, there's quite a couple of smaller properties that deal with quite steep hills, and also being a very small property can be quite challenging. How can I set up property of a pasture, paddocks, and how can I integrate this with like a central point and laneways? Can be quite tricky, and sometimes we cannot do everything on contour, but we would like to use the shape of the land as much as possible for the dictation of water, where we can harvest water, but also how we can maybe place certain laneways and therefore also fencing. I will show you a couple of examples later in that combination of track paddocks and linking it with pasture cells. So then once you kind of have all that information, and there's still quite a lot of other things that we may have to consider, but then we can look into subdivision, so the size of the paddocks, and it will depend on the number of horses and the management of your herd. So you have maybe particular needs or special needs that you need to consider, such as the age of horses, if you have older horses and young horses. Vegetation, you also want to take in consideration, do you have shade? Can you put vegetation in certain places to kind of have multiple functions, what we call stacking functions in permaculture? Can it function as a shelter? Can it function as a filtering system? and harvesting, water harvesting, water harvesting systems such as swales, and also the fodder tree aspect, so kind of being able to use it as a drought reserve. So tree belts, not only for wind and shelter, but and shade, but also thinking about hydration and edible fodder for your horse. And then last, or part of it, depending on your situation, we need to look into central point areas and sacrifice areas. And I think that most horse owners are familiar with these and are already incorporating these in their properties, either large or small. It really depends on the management of your horses and the needs of your horses. And we already discussed that in some of our other webinars, talking about if you have too much grass or not enough grass, that we may have to lock our horses up in these sacrifice areas. We'll talk about this at the end. So are there any questions before I talk a little bit more? We're going now and talk about the subdivision, or why it is important. First of all, why it's important to do subdivision, and we base that on the needs of horses, but also about recovery time of pastures. And then we'll go into the sacrifice areas. But for any of the property questions about property design, overlays, programs, do you have any questions? We can address them now rather than until the end, and you may forget about it.
Yep. So if you have any questions, just type them in right now. Otherwise, we'll move on. So we'll just give you 10 seconds to do that if you have any questions.
Well, I will just talk a little bit about this slide, and if there are any questions, we'll address them. Mm-hmm. So once we decided on, once we have all our information and we want to look at our subdivisions, it's very important to understand why we need to do this. And it's all about plant recovery and offering enough pasture availability to our horses. And here are two situations. So if you have two horses, you have only two paddocks and two horses, you only can make one move to rest one paddock, and that may not be enough then for this part to recover, for these grasses to get to a certain height again that they can provide nutrition. And if we return these animals too soon, what we get is that the pasture is getting overbitten and doesn't do really well with the growth, and we see that the root system is having a harder job and is dying off, and we get only shorter and shorter grass. If not, we get also a lot of compaction problems because we keep horses too long on these areas, and there's just no rest enough for these for the soil and for the pasture. So this is what we call more of a, even though we can make two moves, it's still considered a continuous grazing situation. If we then look at the to the picture on the other side, we see that we have 9 cells now, and still we have 2 horses, but now we have more space to move horses, and that equals also more recovery time. So by the time you come back to this cell, you may have more recovery time of probably 3 to 4 months versus that you push the rotation in this end where you overgraze the pasture. So it's very important to look at your moves and how long it will take before you get back to that cell, and that dictates how much recovery time you have. So it could be 3, depends a bit on the growth and depends a bit on the season, but it can be 3 months, it can be 6 months, depending on the size, because this is very schematical, and I didn't put, for instance, the size of the paddocks and that it will dictate how much availability you have. But it's about recovery time. That's one I want to show here.
Just got one question there, Mariette. How deep do swales need to be, and are they necessary in low rainfall areas? It's less than 300 millimetres.
So the swales can also be very useful in high rainfall areas, and I'm going to show later on a picture with the tracks and the cells, which is a property which is the Permaculture Research Institute in the Shannon. And they have a reasonable rainfall, which is around, they're near Byron Bay, so they're quite coastal. They have a subtropical climate, and they use swales. However, some people say when the rainfall is quite high, swales can get saturated and it can hold water too much and it get quite soggy. So some want to make a bit of an adaptation to it so that it's less deep and a bit more shallow. And they call them, you can do it in cooperation with some what they call keyline swales. So I can provide a link to that probably. That's the best thing would be just to provide after this presentation in our follow-up email a little bit of information about swales and a link to swales and the difference of building swales in kind of a more arid system versus more of a high rainfall system. Because yeah, you can get a bit of problem with water logging occasionally in these swales. And therefore you need to make some tweaks on the design. So we call the standard one permaculture swales, and then you have little adaptations called keyline or tree swales that we can use. So I will look that up and provide a link. That's probably the best to illustrate that. Okay, so more cells equals more recovery time, and that is all about for pasture growth to offer pastures enough time to recover. And it has shown research that overgrazing, because people think that overgrazing is generally the number of animals that we keep on a paddock, but that's not the case. It is the time that we expose the plants to the animals. And if we re-expose, as in the previous one, if we re-expose the herbivore to the pasture too often and it's bitten too much, that's when we get overgrazing. But in the other system where we have two animals but in a smaller space, we graze them for shorter and then we move them on. So that's high impact, but then you have a longer resting time, and this is where we see pastures doing much better with dealing with the figure of getting growth happening, as well as that we reduce the compaction problem. So think about time grazing rather than rotational grazing is my suggestion, because I think that rotational grazing is used, but people don't always keep the time factor and this recovery in mind. Okay, so when you then when you have your design, when you put in the current infrastructure, your resources, then you can look at potential ideas. And these are called concepts. And here is one of my concepts of the property of using laneways and making cells to increase my paddock numbers. So here the C1 to, that needs to be C3. But these are the cattle, which I call the cattle large areas, and all the numbers with the P are horse cells, although the cattle could also come through these bigger cells if we wanted to. Because at this stage I do a cell grazing based on mobile fencing, and what I wanted to show here is just an ideal situation if I want to set it up maybe in a more permanent laneway system, so it can also connect to a central point system. But at this present I don't have a central point, but I do the cell grazing as shown here, but I'm making that a little bit more mobile, and I also don't have yet a track or a laneway system happening. But this is just for illustration, just to give some ideas, and this is not necessarily an ideal layout. As you can see here, I worked mainly on reasonably on contour, but I have here a row of paddocks that goes up the hill, and and with this laneway here, that could cause a little bit of erosion if I would overuse that. So ideally, maybe you want to set up paddocks this way, but I considered just the shade and the windbreak of the tree laneway that we currently have here. So I kind of utilize that so that I don't have to put in any major structures, and also on this side, so that you can use those tree laneways. but it probably needs a little bit more vegetation. It's currently only these kind of laneways with a couple of trees. A center point would be handy, particularly from a shelter and also from a water point of view. Now I currently use a mobile water system to feed the water to the horses. And I have only a low number of horses, only 2 horses, but if you have more horses, that would not be always very handy. So you need to look at central point. We do have, as I said, water from tanks, but we may need to look into more water points in each of these sections. Also for cattle, we also use a mobile water system for cattle at this stage so that we can cell graze them. But this is just an example where you look at where you want to position your horses of where you can have a central point which can connect to some of your paddocks. And because we want to keep horses reasonably convenient, closer to areas where we have the stables or riding facilities, but also close to the house, of ease of management, taking the horses in and ride them, or taking care of them. So having a central point that connects these, this is probably the ideal location. So it connects to all of my 4 major paddocks. I probably would not use this large paddock unless I have like a group of horses, large group of horses, then we potentially could utilize that if we're not needing to use them every day. But it's very flexible. It's just just giving my own example of ideas. So what you use is just these overlays, and you can just take them off and you can restart. So it's all about trying to work with your, as I said, with your contouring, with your water points, with your vegetation, and look at the least well, making changes, but trying to be very efficient with it so that you don't have to overuse materials or put another go around with your excess and things like that. So it's all about central location, thinking about access, material use, and utilizing facilities that you already, or features that you already have. So as I said here, the tree laneways. But I probably will redo it. I just quickly came up with this. I actually have no time doing my own property. I'm working on other people's property, but that's life of a consultant, I think. And so this is just a quick example based on the webinar, just to highlight the potential subdivisions and how to link that in the bigger picture with the contouring and water aspects. But property is so personal, so whatever I say may not necessarily be possible in your situation. You may deal with smaller properties, with a smaller acreage, or with a more permanent design. We are reasonably flexible, and my suggestion is that you, if you're new to your property, or even if you want to make designs redesign your property, to use mobile systems, even for your central point systems, and then look at how that works before you may put in these more permanent shelters and fencing and things like that, so that you have had a couple of seasons to look at how it all works when there's high rainfall or droughts, and that may change quite a lot, and how big you want to subdivide paddocks, and where you want to potentially place your laneways. So pasture planning, as I said, it's all about recovery time, so about leaf area management. So we don't want to overgraze grasses. We want to keep a certain length as well. So it's not only about thinking about the recovery as in the time that we need for the time that we have to allow for the pasture plant to recover, but it starts already with monitoring how low you can graze it. So when you decide on moving the horses, you need to really look at how much have they already eaten from the plant. So what leaf area do you have available? And 4 and 5 centimeters of what we call C3 grasses, or more your temperate grasses, is very the lowest. I would probably say more around 6 centimeters is kind of your threshold, and then you want to move horses. In tropical systems, so in subtropical and tropical systems where you have C4 pasture plants, they need a little bit more leaf area. They need more like 8 centimeters or more to have a reasonable well recovery, to have enough vigor and energy to restore and to grow again. So it's very important that you move your animals based on leaf area, and that you think about the time, that you also think about the time grazing. So in HM, in holistic management, they actually say that when when the pasture growth is slow, you actually move a bit slower so that you allow each cell to have enough recovery. And if it's fast growth, you can actually move much faster, so you may not always graze to the lowest end of your leaf area. So those are kind of things that that are a bit different from current rotational grazing systems. So here are a couple of here's a picture that shows the movement. So this is a group in individual grazing, group grazing, and you move them to the next cell, and they use mobile fencing. And it's not that hard. It's very simple, and I personally really like, this is our property, I really like the mobile fencing. So we have permanent fencing, but I personally like the hot tape to move animals. It gives you flexibility, and also you can pull it all down if you need to do some management, such as key lining. It's easy to just pull it down, and then it's much easier to work the bigger paddock in one piece rather than doing it in small sections. But if you're in an adjustment, or if you have already permanent fencing, that may be a bit harder, but there may be areas that you think about doing subdivision, but you may want to think about using first a mobile system, and see how that is going, and also look at what pasture management you may need in those areas. Okay, so we already talked about water and shade. I'm not going to discuss this in more detail, but these are things that you need to consider, either mobile or central. It depends a little bit on your time and ease of convenience. What are your preferences? And also shade, structure, or vegetation, some combination of those. Fencing, yeah, we already talked about mobile fencing. There's various different types of permanent fencing. But what is important is this couple of notes that we need to consider when we are, even if we are looking at permanent or and at mobile fencing, that we need to look at the space, so the width of our gateways, and that they are safe. And of course it will depend a little bit on the number of horses. So if you have laneways where you want to have more than 2 or 3 horses in, you may have to look at a larger width of the laneway. The height will depend a little bit on the type of horse. So if you have big horses or small horses, and you may have to have, if you have a combination, so if you sometimes have smaller horses and then larger horses, you may have to have more wires or more railings to facilitate for that. Or if you're dealing with foals, you may want to look at particular mesh fencing, and there's many fences out there, and it really depends on the budget and on your preferences, on the type of horses you manage. Those are all things to consider. Pasture planning, so besides just thinking about your subdivisions of the pasture, not everybody is able to just graze their horses 24 hours, either because you're on a smaller property, you don't have enough pasture availability, and therefore you cannot do all the moves to allow for enough recovery. So you may have to take the horses out of the pasture rotation and put them into sacrificial area central point systems, where you can manage the pastures, but at the same time manage their feed intake. So these can be very handy, especially also if you have the opposite. You have enough pasture, but your horse is sugar sensitive or gains a lot of weight, and you need to control its feed intake. Or you may need to look into stabling, or a combination of those. So again, coming back to my picture, as I said, I made a central point here with a shelter, and that is connecting to the paddock, so it can be connected to these, and pretty much they can go and connect to these sections, and even up to here. So this is also a laneway that we can put along the tree belt. So again, I talked already about this, that you want to look at the central point and that you have ease of access to different parts of your property. Sometimes that is not possible. If you have a waterway, you may have to look into, and it divides your property, you may have to look at 2 central point systems. It really depends on the shape of your land and kind of what we call the limitations, and you may have to look into more areas where you can take horses off because they cannot be connected. So also if you have different groups of horses, so older horses versus young horses or stallions and mares. So it really depends on your management. And I could have probably put another central point on the top end and maybe cut the tree laneway and connect the paddocks that way. That may be another concept design that I may draw. So this is one, and I make a lot. So I advise you to just do a lot of designs. It's not an overnight decision, and just with a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, start drawing or on the computer or by hand, and make many and reevaluate that over X amount of months, and then come up with your final plan and then start implementing it. Central point system, we already talked a lot about this in the webinars. So clearly people are aware that we can take horses off the pasture, where we allow horses to congregate, where we allow compaction, where we offer supplementary feeds, and you can then link it to laneway systems, so the so-called track paddocks, or Jamie Jackson paddock paradise concept that people may be familiar of. But it's very important that we are still considering their feed intake. Also, some requirements that we need to think about. This is safe. It's very important, because you congregate animals, that you need to maybe look in more permanent fencing for safety. Also for the footing, as you can see here, you want to have this kind of cladded so that you avoid erosion, so your footing kind of is washed down into your paddock. But you don't necessarily have to do super permanent. See, here's still a bit of electric tape with posts. Can be steel frame. It really depends a little bit on your at what stage you are. Is your central point, are you starting with your central point? Maybe you want to use mobile fencing, or have you already decided on your central point? You may want to look then in a more permanent setup, and also looking into your shelter design. As you can see, it can be connected to, a bit fancy, to stables, or it can be connected, or you can just have only like a shelter type of situation, as here demonstrated here in this picture. It's all about also the ease of how we can manage. Of course, budget and the size will depend on how many horses you want to have in there. And you may, as I said, have 2 central points instead of 1. Footing, very important that we think about erosion control. And I already put here, like they call it kickboard, or that you box it in so that your footing, if it's, for instance, like your pea rock gravel or your coarse river sand, that it's not washed onto your paddocks, because you invest in that, and you want to keep that, and you may have to top it up over time. And the type that you want to use will really depend a bit on the budget, on the preference for footing of the horse, or what you prefer, what your horses do well on, and what they find comfortable. And you can use a combination in certain areas. And in very high traffic areas, or if you want to go a bit more fancier, you can actually use these grid system erosion tiles, or so there's a company called GeoHex that offers these, and in America they actually come on a full roll. Here it seems that we use tiles, and they can really help very well with erosion control around, for instance, water points or in these sacrificed areas. But they will add a little bit more to your budget. So here, another kind of drawn-up design made on the computer, smaller property using the arena as a central point. So you don't necessarily have to have a very designated area for your central point. You can actually use your arena if you wanted to, especially if you want to keep as much pasture available. But you could do a combination. It really depends on your daily management and how often you use the arena, and you can connect it then with your stable. So this is based on a smaller property. And here's a picture of laneways that are not necessarily grass. They actually used a full footing here, which can add up. I've seen it in America, and here is in Netherlands, which is connected to an indoor arena where they can have, this is on a stud and a riding school, and they can have the groups of mares when it gets very wet and they have to take them off the pasture during summer or late autumn. They can house them in the laneways and in the indoor. So they use the indoor a little bit as a central point, but not all the time. Here's the picture on the combination of the laneways with the cell paddocks. So the Jamie Jackson paddock paradise concept, or the track paddocks, are generally only about the tracks. They are not necessarily connected to cells, with the idea because of sugar-sensitive horses. But ideally, if possible, you want to kind of use your laneways and as well as your pastures, and you can close certain areas and open others so that you can still recover and manage the pasture. But at the same time, you can allow movement and move animals in certain directions where you want them. And this property shows really really well the track. The track. This is not of this property, but an example of your laneways. But this one is this red track is on contour, so it really is trying to work with the shape of the land and trying to reduce erosion, because this is kind of a valley and this is quite hilly. So they try to use the contour as much to dictate where they would have their track to avoid erosion. At the same time, it can be on the top end of a swale. So here we see all the swales, all these kind of light gray ones. Those are the swales. And so you can actually combine your laneway on the top end of your swale, because then water that comes onto the track and that is washed off it comes into your swale and is captured in the swale and is kind of held in the swale, because it's a swale is a on contour. It's a on contour level bank, so it doesn't drain the water. It kind of sits the water and soaks the water in to the deeper layers, and that can be very ideal, that combination. So that's actually shown in this area very well. Here's another swale and another swale. So working on contour can be very beneficial to harvest water and to prevent as much as possible erosion. With the laneways, I already mentioned it, where we need to look at how many animals we want to have in these laneways. 3 to 6 meters is the kind of average width that you need to look into. Gate width of minimum of 3 meters, and you may want to have double gates if you have more horses and if you want to move them through the laneway. Connect laneways with, for instance, central point systems. Try to think about rounding your corners as much as possible. That's ideal, but sometimes our system is really set up the conventional way, and we have to deal with 90-degree angles. I don't think that's necessarily an issue, but just something just to think about in the width of the laneways. But it's a consideration, and if you're using mobile fencing, as you can see, you can easily do that. also footing, you can also look into footing. So I showed you that picture of the Netherlands where they had sand. Here they have a bit of like a wood chip footing. And then finally, it is also important that that if you are in these if you have to manage your horses in these laneway systems, that you again think about your forage availability and your enrichment. So looking into feeding stations where either you use slow feeding stations or offer ad-lib hay, and or think about that, as I said, the fodder tree, offering horses browse to occupy them during those times that they may be locked up in sacrificial areas. And supplementary feeding may also be needed depending on your horse, particularly if you're dealing with a sugar-sensitive horse. You may need to use a combination of conserved forages and low GI super fiber foods. So that's just very important, and we spent a webinar on enrichment enrichment strategies for horses. So just in summary, the laneway systems and the connecting with paddocks will help with encouraging horses to move and also socialize, but it will depend. You can actually still, if you need to keep horses individual, you can still use a laneway system and a central point, but you may switch it around if you only have one, or you may have to set up two, so you can or have it divided so they can come in together, but they have their own access and they have their own areas of grazing. Ideally, you want to keep horses as much as possible with a companion, but it depends on your situation. It helps with us controlling the grazing time, reducing compaction in paddocks, safeguarding grass cover and recovery time. And it also will help with reducing your shelter and your water points. And yeah, if you set it up really well, it becomes very efficient for management, and will save you money as well with trying to avoid doing a lot of pastoral management and input of improving pastures, because if you have a system of pasture planning and moving animals, it will do the work for you. And you may occasionally get, depending on the size of your farm, you may have to deal occasionally with compaction over 3 to 4 years, and you may have to do a bit of key lining and renovating pastures, but it will become much less of a problem as if you're doing the continuous grazing. So a combination of cell grazing, track systems, and central point systems is the way to go for most horse properties. I'm not sure if there's a lot of information on the pasture property design, but we have a fact, RSSA has a fact sheet on tips for the care of the confinement of horses. So that's on the website. And we have more events, so check out the RSSA website. I think this was my last one for at least this year. And if you're interested in more information, particularly on pasture grazing and HM, I have actually a chapter on that in the Equine permaculture booklets. And yeah, happy to take any questions. It was very brief, and I had to skip a couple of details, but I hope that it offered you some insight and also offering a little bit my own example. So I'm happy to take any questions.